So this afternoon I'm preaching on Elijah, the prophet, and he's a man whose life was just marked by the supernatural. He lived quite an extraordinary life. And what I want to do is look at some lessons from the life of Elijah. So the sermon's called Lessons from Elisha. And I want to look at 12 lessons. And I won't be preaching long this afternoon, so we will move through some of these points fairly quickly. So I don't want to keep you much longer than half an hour. But if you can turn there, please, in chapter 19 of 1 Kings. If you can turn to verse 15. So this is God talking to Elijah. And he says there, "And the Lord said unto him, Go, return on the way to the wilderness of Damascus, and when thou comest, anoint Hazael to be king over Syria, and Jehu the son of Minshai shall thou anoint to be king over Israel, and Elijah the son of Shaphat of Abel-Maholah shalt thou anoint to be prophet in thy room." So the title of my sermon, like I said, is Lessons from Elijah. And the first lesson, lesson number 1, is that Elijah, he was appointed by God. He was ordained by God to be a prophet. So we can see there that God told Elijah to go and anoint or appoint Elisha to be the prophet after Elijah ascends to heaven. So he wasn't a self-appointed prophet. He didn't take it upon himself to become a prophet, but God ordained Elisha to be the man of God, to take after Elijah. And God was actually, we're going to look at this in a few minutes, God was actually looking at the life of Elijah and watching him, how he conducts himself, how he lives his life, and he chose that this man Elijah, he would be the one to take over from Elijah. It's even the same today. Like the pastors and the leaders in the church, they're not self-ordained, they're not self-appointed, they haven't taken it upon themselves to be a pastor. They've met certain criteria which God has given us in the scriptures to be able to become a pastor, and if they meet these conditions, then we can consider that they've been ordained by God. So we don't want to follow after self-appointed leaders in the church. And the first point there is Elijah, he was ordained by God to be a prophet. Have a look there in 1 Kings chapter 19, verse 19. "So he departed hence and found Elisha, the son of Shaphat, who was ploughing with the 12 yoke of oxen before him, and he with the 12th. And Elijah passed by him, and cast his mantle upon him. And he left the oxen and ran after Elijah, and said, Let me, I pray thee, kiss my father and my mother, and then I will follow thee. And he said unto him, Go back again, for what have I done to thee?" So we can see here, this is when Elijah gets ordained to become a prophet by Elijah. And it seems here that Elijah is a fairly interesting character, because he comes up to Elijah, throws his mantle on him, and he keeps going on his way. And then Elijah says to him, "Well, let me just go back and say goodbye." And Elijah goes, "Well, what have I done to you? You know, do what you want." It's kind of like saying, "You don't owe me anything. I haven't done anything to you that you owe me this." So then Elijah says, "Whatever, do what you want. What have I done to you?" And off he goes. Leaves him there, and Elijah runs back, and being the man of character that he was, he goes back and says goodbye to his family. And then it says there, verse 21, have a look there. "And he returned back from him and took a yoke of oxen and slew them and boiled their flesh with the instruments of the oxen and gave unto the people, and they did eat. Then he arose and went after Elijah and ministered unto him." So Elijah had already left. So he's gone after Elijah and found him and then ministered to him. Like, I don't know, if I was Elijah, I would just say, "Look, I'll just camp here, take as much time as you want, go and say goodbye to your family. Look, I'll be here waiting for you." But not Elijah. Off he goes. And didn't make it easy for Elijah. It sounds like Elijah was a very interesting character. So we can see there that he was ordained by God. And the second lesson is that Elijah was a hard worker. He was a hard worker. So we can see that when God found him, or Elijah found him, he was working the oxen and working on his family's farm. Like, he was someone that was working hard. He was doing things right. And God found him in that state while he's working, because he was watching Elijah. And he was a man of good character, a man that's been faithful in the family home, the family business, and working on the farm. And if you want to be used by God in a great way, well, you need to be doing what you need to be doing right now. If you're a young man, well, you need to be working hard. If you're a young girl, well, you need to be learning from mum and dad, learning from mum how to take care of things in the house, learning how to cook and sew and do all those sort of things. And just be faithful where you are right now, because God's watching. God's watching. And he was watching Elijah, and he saw the character that Elijah had, and he ordained him to be a prophet. And there was many people in the land that weren't given that privilege. Elijah was. And even Jesus, he was the same. He chose people that were working hard. He didn't choose people that were just idle, sitting on their backsides, not doing anything. So let me just read to you Matthew 4. If you can stay there in 1 Kings, I'll just read to you Matthew 4 and verse 18. And Jesus, walking by the Sea of Galilee, saw two brethren, Simon called Peter and Andrew his brother, casting a net into the sea, for they were fishers. And he saith unto them, Follow me, and I will make you fishers of men. See, they were working. They were fishing when Jesus found them and called them. And they straightway left their nets and followed him. And going on from hence, he saw other two brethren, James the son of Zebedee and John his brother, in the ship with Zebedee their father, mending their nets. And he called them, and they immediately left the ship and the father and followed him. So we can see other men who were working hard, being faithful in the family business. They're working there with their father. And God saw that, Jesus saw that, and chose these men that were working hard. So we need to be working hard. If you're a young single person and you want to be used by God greatly, work hard right now. And I think in the church, a great example of that would be Brother Caleb. Like, he's someone who's been faithful in the family home, working hard, holding down a job, proving himself faithful, and he's doing all the right things. God will be watching Brother Caleb and be looking to use his life in a great way. So he's a good example that we can look to in our church of a young man like these apostles and like Elisha, who's working hard. And if you're a young lady and you have a goal to be married, well, just keep working hard in the family home, and God will be watching that, and He'll reward you at the right time by bringing a good husband who can be a blessing to you. So if He sees you that you're going to be a great wife, and you're working at being a great wife and doing those things to prepare yourself now, then He's going to bring a good man to you and be a blessing to you. Same if you're a young man looking to be married. Work hard, and God will see that, and He'll bring a great man into your life who can be a great godly husband. And lesson number 3 is that Elijah was a man that was submitted to the God-given authority in his life. We can see that when Elijah found him, he was submitting to his family, his father, working on the family farm, working hard. And when Elijah came and then anointed him, he left that and left the family home and was following after Elijah, and then submitted to the spiritual authority over him. And we have that spiritual authority in the church. And when we come to church, we need to submit to the spiritual authority that God's given us. And when you're at home, you need to submit to your parents, your mum and dad. And Elijah was someone who did that. But let's look at a couple of verses now from Hebrews 13, verse 17. If you can just turn to 2 Chronicles. If you can turn to 2 Chronicles chapter 16. And while you're turning there, let me just read to you a couple verses, just about how we need to submit to the spiritual authority that we have. And this is what Elijah did, and we're going to look at that in some more detail in just a moment. Hebrews 13:17 says, Obey them that rule, who have the rule over you, and submit yourselves, for they watch for your souls, as they must give account, that they may do it with joy and not with grief, for that is unprofitable for you. So we see in the house of God, we need to submit to the pastor, because the pastor then is accountable to God, and he's looking out for our souls. And children and young people, you need to be making sure you submit to the spiritual authority in your home, in your house. And that's what Elijah did, and God was watching it, and He rewarded Elijah greatly. And same with you, young people. God will reward you greatly. And like I said before, God was watching Elijah. He was watching the land to see who He could pick to be a prophet. And let me read to you from 2 Chronicles, you're there already, 16 verse 9. So 2 Chronicles 16 verse 9. It says there, For the eyes of the Lord run to and fro throughout the whole earth, to show Himself strong in the behalf of them whose heart is perfect towards Him. So God's actually looking across the land to see who He can show Himself strong to. So He's watching your life right now, young people. He's watching how you live your life, what you're doing in your spare time. And God's looking to pick people who He can show Himself strong to. So you're there. If you go back to 2 Kings, please. 2 Kings chapter 2 now. 2 Kings chapter 2. And verse 1, 2 Kings chapter 2, verse 1. And it came to pass, when the Lord would take up Elijah into heaven by a whirlwind, that Elijah went with Elisha from Gilgal. And Elijah said unto Elisha, Tarry here, I pray thee, for the Lord hath sent me to Bethel. And Elijah said unto him, As the Lord liveth, and as thy soul liveth, I would not leave thee. So they went down to Bethel. And my fourth point is this, that Elijah was faithful to God before he was faithful to man. Like Elijah was serving the God of Elijah, not the man Elijah. Like he didn't follow Elijah to a fault. Okay, he followed Elijah as he followed after God. And have a look there in the verse we just read. It says there, And Elijah said unto Elisha, Tarry here, I pray thee, for the Lord hath sent me to Bethel. So Elijah is saying to Elijah, you need to stop here because I'm going to go on and ultimately ascend up into heaven. So if he was following the man, Elisha, he could have just stopped right there and not followed any further. Because he's following the God of Elijah, he didn't obey the man of God in this regard, because he knew, well, God's called me to follow all the way to the very end. But Elijah, obviously, maybe he was testing Elijah, but he didn't have the same conviction that Elijah had. So Elijah, he continued on even when Elijah said, don't follow me any further. Even though Elijah wasn't doing anything wrong, but especially when we're following people and men, like we don't want to follow them to a fault. Like if they're going off the rails, if they're not being biblical, you need to make the call. So look, I'm not going to follow this man anymore. And Elisha did not follow Elijah to a fault. I'm sure Elisha and Elijah didn't agree on everything. They probably had their little quirks that they knew about each other, and they didn't like each other at times, but they both knew that they were in the right place. They were both serving God in the relationship they had with one another, and they were able to look past those quirks and those differences of agreements. They probably didn't agree on every doctrine either, okay, but they knew they were in the right place where God wanted them to be. And Elisha continued on, even though I'm sure Elijah was a bit of a prickly character. But Elijah stayed with him to the very end, and we can see that he inherited a great blessing. And if you can, you'll learn chapter 2 of 2 Kings. Let's have a look at verse 3. Let's keep reading. And the sons of the prophets that were at Bethel came forth to Elijah and said unto him, Knowest thou that the Lord will take away thy master from thy head today? And he said, Yea, I know it. Hold ye your peace. And Elijah said unto him, Tarry here, I pray thee, for the Lord hath sent me to Jericho. And he said, As the Lord liveth, and as thy soul liveth, I would not leave thee. So they came to Jericho, and the sons of the prophets that were at Jericho came to Elijah and said unto him, Knowest thou that the Lord will take away thy master from thy head today? And he answered, Yea, I know it, hold your peace. And Elijah said unto him, Tarry, I pray thee, here, for the Lord hath sent me to Jordan. And he said, As the Lord liveth, and as thy soul liveth, I would not leave thee. And they two went on, and 50 men of the sons of the prophets went and stood to view afar off, and they too stood by Jordan. So we can see here, it's not easy for Elijah to keep on this mission on following Elijah, because the sons of the prophets, every town they go to, they're saying, don't you know Elijah's going to be taken away from you today? So these are distracting voices in Elijah's ear, and he's saying, hold your peace, I know it, just hold your peace. And even Elijah himself is saying, you need to stay here, stop following after me. But he was committed that he was in the will of God, he was following after God. And sometimes that's what it's like when you're following after God. You're going to have voices distracting you, trying to stop you from following after God. And we need to be like Elijah and say, look, hold your peace. Or we might say, well, you need to shut up. Is what we would say in today's time. But here's Elisha saying, hold your peace, or shut up, I don't need to hear all that. And that's how we need to be. But notice that these sons of the prophets, none of them were chosen by God to follow after Elijah. They weren't chosen to be the man of God. Elijah, he was the one that God chose. And if Elijah, if he had to quit any of these times at each town they were going through, he would have missed out on receiving the blessing. And verse 9, 2 Kings chapter 2, verse 9, And it came to pass, when they were gone over, that Elijah said unto Elisha, Ask what I shall do for thee before I be taken away from thee. And Elisha said, I pray thee that a double portion of thy spirit be upon me. Lesson number 5, the lesson we can take from Elijah, number 5, is don't be afraid to pray big prayers. Don't be afraid to pray big prayers. Here's Elijah. He's praying a massive prayer. And he's prayed, I pray thee a double portion of thy spirit be upon thee. And verse 10, and he said, Thou hast asked a hard thing. Nevertheless, if thou see me when I am taken from heaven, it shall be so unto thee. But if not, it shall not be so. So we need to, like Elijah, lesson we can learn here is we need to pray big prayers. Don't be afraid to pray bold prayers. Let me just read to you just quickly. John 14 verse 13 says there, And whatsoever ye shall ask in my name, that will I do, that the Father may be glorified in the Son. If you shall ask anything in my name, I will do it. So we can pray big prayers, and we have a great promise here from Jesus that he will do those things. Amen. John chapter 15, verse 7. If ye abide in me, and my words abide in you, ye shall ask what ye will, and it shall be done unto you. So God's looking to answer big prayers. God answered the big prayer of Elijah, and we need to be bold and don't be afraid to pray big prayers. But have a look there in verse 11. Something interesting there. Verse 10, sorry. It says there, and he said, Thou hast asked a hard thing. Nevertheless, if thou see me when I am taken from thee, it shall be so unto thee. But if not, it shall not be so. So lesson number 6 is we need to set our eyes on the right things. We need to set our eyes on the things of God. Elijah said, if you see me when I ascend into heaven, then you receive it. So if we want to receive the answers to our big prayers that we pray, we need to be looking on the right things. We need to be looking upon the Word of God and not looking at the worldly things. If Elijah just checked out and went to the movies and started watching TV or things like that, well, he would have missed out. But because he's looking at the right things, he was there at the right time and he received the double portion of Elijah's spirit. Let me just read to you from, if you can turn there as well, to Philippians chapter 4. Philippians 4 and verse 8. So how can we learn to look at the right things? How can we learn to set our eyes on the right things? Well, it depends upon what you think about. It's going to determine what you ultimately end up setting your eyes upon. Philippians 4:8, it says, Finally, brethren, whatsoever things are true, whatsoever things are honest, whatsoever things are just, whatsoever things are pure, whatsoever things are lovely, whatsoever things are of good report, if there be any virtue and if there be any praise, think on these things. So we need to think upon the things which are good, the things which have virtue, and think on the things of God. And that way we're going to start to set our eyes on the right things, and you'll be able to see the answers to your prayers. And those big prayers that you're praying, God's going to answer those prayers. Lesson 6 was set your eyes on the things of God. And that was the condition that Elijah had in order to receive that double portion of Elijah's spirit. And verse 11 of 2 Kings chapter 2. And it came to pass, as they still went on and talked, that behold, there appeared a chariot of fire and horses of fire, and parted them both asunder, and Elijah went up by a whirlwind into heaven. So we can see here that finally Elijah's made it to the very end, and Elijah's taken up to heaven, and he's right there, and he saw it. Verse 12. 2 Kings 2 verse 12. And Elijah saw it, and he cried, my father, the chariot of Israel and the horsemen thereof. And he saw him no more, and he took hold of his own clothes and rent them in 2 pieces. He took up also the mantle of Elijah that fell from him, and went back and stood by the bank of Jordan. And he took the mantle of Elijah that fell from him and smote the waters and said, where is the Lord God of Elijah? So here we see here that he's always following after the Lord God of Elijah, not Elijah himself. And when he also had smitten the waters, they parted hither and thither, and Elijah went over. And when the sons of the prophets which were to view at Jericho saw him, they said, the spirit of Elijah doth rest on Elisha. And they came to meet him and bowed themselves to the ground before him. So that's a pretty wild story. Elijah, he sees a man descend up into heaven in fiery chariots, receives his mantle, falls down upon him, and he strikes the river, and the river parts. That's pretty wild stuff. Talk about having a double portion of God's power upon your life. And Elisha, he had been faithful in serving the authority over his life to the very end, and now he's received a double portion of his spirit, and his own ministry begins. And lesson number 7 is that you will reap if you remain faithful. And Elisha, he was faithful to God to the very end, and he reaped an incredible reward. Hebrews 6 verse 10, I'll just read it to you. For God is not unrighteous to forget your work and labour of love, which ye have showed towards his name, in that ye have ministered to the saints and do minister. And we desire that every one of you do show the same diligence to the full assurance of hope unto the end, that ye be not slothful, but followers of them who through faith and patience inherit the promises. So that's certainly true of Elijah's life. He inherited the promise that he had, or what he believed that he would receive from God. He inherited that double portion. And you too, if you remain faithful and keep ploughing away, keep doing what you're supposed to be doing, you're going to receive a great reward for that from God. And verse 23, back to 2 Kings chapter 2, verse 23. And he went up from hence unto Bethel, and as he was going up by the way, there came forth little children out of the city, and mocked him, and said unto him, Go up, thou bald head, go up, thou bald head. And he turned back and looked on them, and cursed them in the name of the Lord. And there came forth 2 she-bears out of the wood, and tare 42 children of them. So that's a pretty wild story here. And lesson number 8 is we need to discipline our children. We can learn from Elijah. We need to discipline our children. We need to train them up in the admonition of the Lord. And Georgia and Lily and myself, Aaron, were talking about this story, I think, yesterday. And Georgia said that maybe Elijah was a bit sensitive about his bald head, a bit sensitive about his hairline. And maybe he was. But there's a lesson here that we can learn. It says there also, have a look there, it says, verse 23, the little children, so these are just little children, and they were out of the city. So my question is where's their parents? So there's 42 children, little children, and they're gone out of the city. And where are their parents? So these kids were unruly, they weren't being disciplined, and they really offended Elisha by mocking him like this. And I think the reason was, or perhaps, is that Elisha, he wasn't raised like this. He was raised with discipline upon his life. He was raised to work hard and work on his father's farm, yet these children are roaming around outside the city, and they're just mocking him. And kids can be like that today. Look, I run around my neighbourhood where I live, and often there's little kids out at night time, and they'll just mock me and just say, nasty things to me just while I'm running around. And the question is, well, where's their parents? And so Elijah here, he curses these children, and 2 she-bears come out of the woods and kills them, tears them apart. That's pretty wild. So the lesson here is that we need to raise our children well. We don't want our children to be out walking around at night time harassing people, okay? If you can turn to Deuteronomy chapter 21, verse 18. Deuteronomy chapter 21, verse 18. Let's have a look and see what God thinks about unruly children. And while you're turning there, let me read to you Leviticus 20, verse 9. For every one that curseth his father or his mother shall be surely put to death. He have cursed his father or his mother, his blood shall be upon him. And that's what the Bible says about children that would curse their fathers or mother. You might say, well, these children weren't cursing their father or mother, they were cursing Elijah, but it's pretty safe to say if they're cursing some stranger, they probably are cursing their parents as well. Okay, but you might also say, well, come on, Jason, that's the Old Testament. That's the Old Testament. We're in the New Testament now. Okay, what would Jesus do? Surely Jesus wouldn't be okay with this. Well, glad you asked. Let me read to you Matthew 15, verse 3. But he answered and said unto them, and this is Jesus talking, Why do ye also transgress the commandment of God by your tradition? For God commanded, saying, Honour thy father and mother, and he that curseth father or mother, let him die the death. So Jesus said, this is what God commanded. He commanded this. So Jesus didn't say, well, Moses said, or God said, but now I say, put them in time out. He didn't say that. He just confirms that this is the word of God, that God said it, and as far as Jesus is concerned, God's still saying it. That's how God still feels today about unruly children. And the lesson is we need to make sure we discipline our children so they don't become like these children which under Old Testament times could be put to death. So you're there in Deuteronomy chapter 21, verse 18. And let's have a look at what it says there. If a man have a stubborn and rebellious son, which would not obey the voice of his father or the voice of his mother, and that, when they have chastened him, will not hearken unto them, then shall his father and his mother lay hold on him and bring him out into the elders of his city and unto the gate of his place, and they shall say unto the elders of his city, This our son is a stubborn and rebellious. He will not obey our voice. He is a glutton and a drunkard, and all the men of his city shall stone him with stones that he die. So shalt thou put away evil from among you, and all Israel shall hear and fear. So that's pretty serious consequence. If you fail to discipline your children, they become drunkards and gluttons and rebellious. Well, there's grounds here to have them put to death, and that's pretty serious. And that's to be an example to us today, that we ought to put the effort in and raise our children in the fear and admonition of the Lord. Because if you've got children which are like rebellious and drunkards, they're going to grow up to become adults which are rebellious and drunkards, and they're going to do people harm. They're going to become your future murderers and rapists and all these manner of evil things. These children can grow into doing so. God's saying, well, just if they're like that, put them to death. Save society a headache. But ultimately, we don't want that to happen. We want children to be raised up to believe on God and to be saved. Lesson number 8 was discipline your children. We can learn that from Elijah. Lesson number 9, Elijah was not a respecter of persons. Elisha was not a respecter of persons. So if you can turn to 2 Kings chapter 5 and verse 9. We're going to look at the story of Naaman, who was a leper. So Naaman was the in charge of the armies of Syria. And what had happened is like a maid from Israel had been taken captive by Syria, and she was serving the wife of Naaman. And she said to Naaman's wife, well, if only you could meet the prophet would heal Naaman of his leprosy. And then obviously Naaman hears about this, and he finds himself on the way to visit Elisha. Have a look there in verse 9, 2 Kings 5 verse 9. This is probably one of my favourite stories about Elisha. I love this aspect about his life. It's so interesting. So Naaman came with his horses and with his chariot and stood at the door of the house of Elisha. That would be quite something, wouldn't it, being able to visit a man of God like Elisha? And verse 10, I love this. Elisha sent a messenger unto him. So Elisha didn't even get up off the couch and go answer the door himself for the commander of the army of Syria. He just sends a messenger to the door. Like, I love that. Like, no respecter of persons at all. I think that's just awesome. And Elijah sent a messenger unto him, saying, Go and wash in Jordan 7 times, and thy flesh shall come again to thee, and thou shalt be clean. But Naaman was wroth, and went away, and said, Behold, I thought he will surely come out to me, and stand and call on the name of the Lord his God, and strike his hand over the place, and recover the leper. So he was a bit offended that Elisha didn't bother answering the door. And I love that. Like, he was no respecter of persons. And this reminded me of Hillsong. They are respecter of persons. In their conferences, they would get politicians to come at the start of the conference, open the conference and do this big speech, and everyone will just applaud, but not so Elisha. He wouldn't even get up off his couch for one of these worldly people. So we need to be like Elisha. Don't show respect unto politicians or leaders in the world and treat them better than you would any brother or sister. So if the mayor came into this church and you were to show him respect over one of the brothers and sisters here, then you'd be out of order. Elijah wasn't like that. And he wasn't intimidated by these people, by politicians or people of power in the land. And that's the lesson we can learn. Lesson number 10, and we're just about done now. Elijah did not covet money. He wasn't covetous at all. So have a look at 2 Kings chapter 5 and verse 15 now. Just jump down to verse 15. And this is a great quality that Elijah has as well, which we can learn from. And he returned to the man of God, he and all his company. This is after Naaman was healed. and came and stood before him, and he said, Behold now, I know there is no God in all the earth but in Israel. Now therefore, I pray thee, take a blessing of thy servant. And he said, As the Lord liveth, before whom I stand, I will receive none. And he urged him to take it, but he refused. Isn't that a great quality? Like, he was not in love with money at all. Even after he was urged, come on, take this money, he refused. He was not bound by the love of money. He was totally free from the love of money. But not so with Elijah's servant Gehazi. And this is one of the most saddest stories in the Bible. Let's keep reading down to, if you can jump down to verse 20, and look at the contrast between Elijah and his servant Gehazi. But Gehazi, the servant of Elisha, the man of God, said, Behold, my master hath spared Naaman this Syrian in not receiving at his hands that which he brought. But as the Lord liveth, I will run after him and take somewhat of him. So we can see that this guy loves money. So Gehazi followed after Naaman, and when Naaman saw him running after him, he lighted down from the chariot to meet him and said, Is all well? And he said, All is well. My master hath sent me, saying, Behold, even now there be come to me from Mount Ephraim 2 young men of the sons of the prophets. Give them, I pray thee, a talent of silver and 2 changes of garments. So he's not only coveting after money, now he's telling lies. He's a liar as well. You can see how the love of money is the root of all evil. Because he loves money, now he's just making up these lies. And Naaman said, Be content, take 2 talents. And he urged him, and bound 2 talents of silver in 2 bags with 2 changes of garments, and laid them upon 2 of his servants, and they bare them before him. And when he came to the tower, he took them from their hand and bestowed them in the house, and he let the men go, and they departed. But he went in and stood before his master, and Elijah said unto him, Whence comest thou, Gehazi? And he said, Oh, thy servant went no whither. So he's lying again. He said, What are you talking about? I've been nowhere. And he said unto him, Went not mine heart with thee when the man turned again from his chariot to meet thee? Is it a time to receive money and to receive garments and olive yards and vineyards and sheep and oxen and men servants and maidservants? The leprosy therefore of Naaman shall cleave unto thee, unto thy seed forever. And he went out from his presence as a leper, as white as snow. So we can see the contrast between these 2 men. Elijah had no business, no interest in chasing after money, but Gehazi, he loved money, and it caused him to lie, and he became disqualified. Being covetous is a disqualification from being a pastor. And Gehazi disqualified himself, and not only that, but he got leprosy, and he's kicked out of being a part of Elijah's ministry, if you like. What a shame, what a waste to blow it, to actually be serving a great man like Elijah, or one of the greatest men to ever walk the earth, and to blow it over loving money. And we don't want to blow our ministry, our reputation by loving after money. What a waste. And then Gehazi, all that became of him, that he was a washed up man just telling stories of the good old days. Don't turn there, but 2 Kings 8 verse 4 says there, And the king talked with Gehazi, the servant of the man of God, saying, Tell me, I pray thee, all the great things that Elijah have done. So all he's doing is just telling stories about the good old days, and you don't want to be like that. Because we come across people like that, don't we? All they're doing is talking about, 20 years ago this happened, and I actually met this person, and we did this, and he waved at me one time, and I waved back, and we don't want to be like that. We want to be telling great stories right now, the great things that God's doing in our lives. And that's the lesson we can learn from Elijah, is that we don't want to covet after money. In verse 11, now jump over to, lesson 11. Lesson 11, have a look at 2 Kings chapter 13. Two Kings chapter 13 verse 14. And lesson 11 is that godly people can get sick. Godly people can get sick. It says there, 2 Kings 13 verse 14. Now Elijah was sick, was fallen sick of his sickness, whereof he died. So we can see there that Elisha, the great man of God, actually got sick. And a lot of Christians will say to you, well, if you get sick or there's some sickness in your life, well, it's because you're a sinner. It's because you've committed some sort of sin. Look, that may be the case, but See here, the great man Elijah, even though he didn't commit any sins, but this sickness came upon him and actually was the cause of his death. So just realise sickness is a part of life, okay? And that's a lesson we can learn. And we don't need to jump to conclusions and say, well, you're sick because you've done some wicked sin. Well, Elijah got sick and he died of that sickness. In verse 20, just jump down to verse 20. And Elijah died, and they buried him, and the bands of the Moabs invaded the land at the coming of the year. And he actually died of that sickness. Okay, lesson 12, lesson 12 from the life of Elijah is that there will be a resurrection of the dead. Now, this is probably one of the wildest stories in the whole Bible. Even though Elijah's dead and all that's left of him is bones, he's still doing miracles. Let's have a look there. 2 Kings chapter 13, if you can turn there. 2 Kings chapter 13, verse 21. I can remember the first time I read this story about 25 years ago. It really stuck out to me then, and I can remember, the first time I read it, because it's such a wild story. And it came to pass, as they were burying a man, that behold, they spied a band of men, and they cast the man into the sepulchre of Elijah. And when the man was let down and touched the bones of Elijah, he revived and stood up on his feet. I reckon that's an incredible story. Like, there's so much power in Elijah's bones that they're trying to bury this dead guy, and he falls on Elijah's bones, and God sees fit to raise him from the dead. This guy jumps back to life again. And the lesson that we can learn from that story is that there will be a resurrection of the dead. Let me read to you John 5, verse 28. Marvel not at this, for the hour is coming in which all that are in the graves shall hear his voice and shall come forth. They that have done good unto the resurrection of life, and they that have done evil unto the resurrection of damnation. So everyone who's in the graves will come back to life in a sense, and they will stand before the judgment seat and be judged according to their works. But the righteous, we won't be judged according to our works, because we've already received the righteousness of Christ. So when we're raised from the dead, we'll receive our new bodies, and we will be in those glorified bodies. But these people who haven't been saved, who have been in hell for thousands of years, hundreds of years, are going to be raised from the dead back in their bodies to stand before the judgment seat of Christ and be judged according to the works, and found to be sinners, and then cast back into the lake of fire. And so this guy here, being raised from the dead, he's a picture that there will be a resurrection from the dead. And that's the 12th and last lesson which we can learn from Elijah. So we'll leave it there.